Tapu Bulu tries really hard, but he doesn't like poison attacks. Nick's team, I think, is probably a bit more oddball than some of the stuff that we've seen. Definitely familiar with the Gigalith teams that we've seen so far this week. But here we're going to have TOLER running Garchomp, Tapu Koko, Celesteela, Snorlax, Arcanine, and that Ninetales that was just being discussed. And Nick has a team of Arcanine, Clefairy, Salamence, something you don't see every day, Kartana, Snorlax, and again, Tapu Bulu, something that's maybe not as common as people would like. So again, as per discussing that Alolan Ninetales, it has control of the weather. It's pretty much free to just kind of blizzard things away. At least 3 things on Nick's team not really wanting to take blizzards.
I think the most important thing here for Nick is going to be how he uses that Kartana. It does match the speed of the Alolan Ninetales in many, many instances. And if it does that, it's an awkward coin flip for both players, not wanting to allow that to go up. So we are going to see Tapu Bulu and Arcanine in the lead from Nick. That Tapu Bulu coming out very, very early. There is definitely going to be some contest for the control of the terrain rather than the weather that we've seen in previous years, as TOLER matches him with Garchomp and Tapu Koko.
So definitely interesting choices from both players. Arcanine, of course, going to be able to get Intimidate off onto that Garchomp, so definitely a benefit there. Garchomp, of course, matches both Arcanine and Tapu Bulu. It happens to be carrying that poison jab that it commonly does. Tapu Koko also has the potential, I believe, to redirect and switch out with Volt Switch, and it's got a lot of spread damage with Dazzling Gleam and Discharge, as well as we've seen. So, I mean, there's a lot of things that both players could honestly be doing at this point.
Tapu Koko, I think, getting out is going to be super important, as we've seen in a number of games. Control of that terrain is absolutely essential, and the way that TOLER has built his team, the Tapu Koko becomes a real core component. So making sure it's set up to its best success is very, very important, as we see Nick maybe making a bit of a read here, getting rid of that Arcanine.
Arcanine's getting withdrawn for Clefairy, so Friend Guard is present. And that's exactly what Tapu Koko does, goes for the Volt Switch into Tapu Bulu. Tapu Bulu not taking a whole lot of damage from it, but the repositioning and the resetting of terrain later on in the game, potentially for TOLER, I think is the bigger impact that's making. Arcanine able to come in for TOLER and get an Intimidate off on Clefairy, which not really so much mattering, but definitely that Tapu Bulu, which it doesn't want to be intimidated. But the poison jab from the Garchomp connects with Tapu Bulu and does a lot of damage. But not as much as you might expect. So Tapu Bulu here going to reveal the Gracium Z. We are going to have a Balloon Doom turn 1 in this top 4.
Yeah, Bloom Doom likely going to be knocking out, I believe, this Garchomp. We saw that that's something he's clearly scared of. This Tapu Bulu comfortably taking that poison jab, something that we don't see so often, but Garchomp was really shoehorned into a certain way of play. Bloom Doom actually falling short of the knockout. We joke about the invisible focus sash, but it was on our side, and we saw it survived. It was clinging on with 1 hit point. That is absolutely insane.
I want to know how Arcanine can thief away an invisible focus sash, because that is clearly the best item in the game. Oh my goodness, I don't think anyone expected that to happen.
Well, I mean, the thing is, we looked at the way TOLER played that turn, and Poison Jab doesn't get the knockout because of Friend Guard. So we kind of understand how that one goes, and you think, alright, he's going to be able to retaliate really, really well with this Bloom Doom, but he falls that little bit short, and now he has to take potentially another Poison Jab. He could also be forced into protecting a little bit. I think TOLER, with the health disadvantage in this turn, is going to have to be a little bit cautious.
So Arcanine, or Garchomp rather, getting withdrawn. Ninetales coming in, setting up snow warning, so there's going to be hail abound on the field now. So Garchomp definitely useful to TOLER, going to get rid of that Intimidate hindrance as Tapu Bulu gets withdrawn for Arcanine, maybe trying to match the potential predict of Ninetales coming back on the field, but Arcanine's going to get intimidated. Clefairy, actually, we're going to see 2 switches from Nick's side. Clefairy getting withdrawn for Snorlax, so we're revealing Pokemon left and right. We've seen all 4 Pokemon on both of these players' teams, as Arcanine goes for a Flare Blitz, intimidated Flare Blitz, mind you, into Nick's Arcanine. A little bit of hail damage to round out the turn, but again, that grassy terrain is up, so everybody's going to get a nice dose of health back.
Yeah, that's going to be a really slow turn with all these hails and grassy terrain boosts. I think Nick actually gets the upper hand in that turn quite significantly because he calls the Arcanine coming in, or the Ninetales coming in. So he switches in his Arcanine for Tapu Bulu. That's not going to take too much damage at all from a big Blizzard. And he also brings in his Snorlax. Now, yesterday we saw something curious on the Snorlax. It was one of those thick, fat Snorlaxes. So both the Arcanine and the Ninetales are going to struggle to deal with it. And even though it's in a great position, Nick decides to switch it around a little bit.
Yeah, Snorlax getting withdrawn for that Clefairy. Ninetales setting up the Aurora Veil, trying to invest in some defensiveness as Arcanine goes for a Will-O-Wisp, but Clefairy avoids the attacks, trying to get that off onto the Snorlax, but to no avail. As Nick's Arcanine uses Toxic to badly poison TOLER's Arcanine. And once again, we're going to see some damage and then some health. So very, very good turn for Nick.
Very smart turn there. I think Clefairy not getting burned certainly helps out with that residual damage. But, you know, he does get the Toxic down as well. And this Ninetales still isn't in a good position with Friend Guard. Arcanine's going to take little to no damage from a Blizzard. You know, it doesn't even really have the chance to slow it down any other way. So overall, he's going to have to start wearing things down. He's almost forced into using Blizzard as well because of the potential Follow Me from Clefairy. We also saw some interesting moves on Clefairy yesterday that could keep Nick's team around. His whole strategy seems to be, you know, keeping his partners healthy and making sure they're always doing well. TOLER really needs to start getting some big super effective hits off, but he just seems a step or two behind in how he wants to get those done. The Ninetales isn't going to do it. He needs something like the Garchomp, which is even going to struggle. It won't be able to Earthquake at this current moment, or it will, but it won't do too much damage because of grassy terrain.
We're going to have grassy terrain actually get reset here. Maybe TOLER heard you in the back of his mind somewhere. As electric terrain gets set up, no more grassy terrain. Tapu Bulu, however, getting replaced with Arcanine. Nick calling these switches shot for shot. Ninetales, we don't know if Ninetales is going to go for Blizzard, calling that, getting big damage onto Tapu Bulu, enough to knock it out, and a little bit onto Clefairy as well. So a big turn for TOLER, getting rid of that Tapu Bulu. So now, if he has the option to switch Tapu Koko back out again, he's able to reposition the terrain back in his favor. Garchomp is going to be able to do big earthquakes, but under that grassy terrain, it's not going to be doing as much. So TOLER getting some good defensive with Aurora Veil, which there's no way for Nick to really do away with, as well as the terrain advantage, potentially. I think TOLER just found his way back into momentum.
Yeah, that was a very big turn. Calling that Tapu Bulu coming in was absolutely essential because Nick kind of looked like he had the upper hand there and, you know, was going to leave Arcanine in. TOLER doesn't tolerate that, knows that he may want to cycle the Intimidate back out later, so he just goes for Blizzard with Ninetales, and even with the Friend Guard, isn't enough to keep it around. Of course, Tapu Koko now has that liberty, as you just mentioned, to switch out, bring itself back in. I think switching is going to be essential with that Toxic in play.
Clefairy going for Protect, wanting to preserve that Friend Guard a little bit longer. Tapu Koko, in fact, going for Volt Switch into Snorlax, doing a decent amount of damage. Not maybe what you would expect, but we're not in electric terrain, folks, so it's not going to be nearly as much as we might think. Arcanine coming out, going to be able to Intimidate, reposition, so the Tapu Koko can come in a little bit later and set up the electric terrain once again. Intimidates abound as Ninetales just fires off Blizzard as it is now free to do. Snorlax is going to take very little damage. Again, that thick fat coming in very handy as Snorlax sets up a curse, and it's curse time.
Yeah, this is going to be a slower pace. Of course, the curse only brings it back to its normal attack stat, but getting that defense boost is big. There's a very curious interaction with Nick's Snorlax. It does have the thick fat, as we saw by the minimal damage it took from Blizzard. That confirms it for TOLER, if he hasn't seen it yet. I think the percentage hail damage actually does more overall than the Blizzard. But he has to be very, very careful. With the defense boost, it's going to be hard for him to find a move to comfortably knock it out. What he needs to do is leave it at above 25%, around like 30% of its health, and then just find something that will knock it out. There are also other options to essentially neuter the Snorlax's use. If the Arcanine's carrying Will-O-Wisp, now could be a great turn. He still has to be conscious though of the Clefairy with the Follow Me. That could be a big deal if that's what Nick decides to go for. But Snorlax just going to have to start setting itself up, playing for that end game. And if Ninetales is still around, it may be legible to get another Aura Veil up.
Yeah, I mean, TOLER definitely has control of the field in terms of weather and terrain. There is no question about that. Snorlax might be causing some problems here with those curses, though. Clefairy actually going to go ahead and become the center of attention. Wants some attention, but Ninetales, of course, firing off those blizzards, doesn't much care for the Follow Me as Arcanine goes for a Will-O-Wisp onto the Clefairy. I'm willing to bet TOLER was hoping to land that on the Snorlax, but a high horsepower from a cursed Snorlax into the Arcanine. Got to do a decent amount of damage, but not a whole lot. I think it may be, in fact, impacted by that grassy terrain, perhaps. Yeah, and now we have lots of recovery, lots of damage, lots of things happening. Of course, that Aurora Veil is still up, I believe, so that definitely helped impact that high horsepower.
That hit, yeah. I mean, now TOLER, even with the Pokemon advantage, I think is kind of forced almost to switch out this Ninetales. If he wants to set up another Aurora Veil, he needs the Hail. It doesn't function without the Hail, so that's very, very important for him overall. Really gonna have to switch carefully though. As soon as he starts switching and getting caught with things, might not work out so well for him. Clefairy is gonna slowly get worn away, but he needs to get rid of that Clefairy. There really is the pressure on TOLER to start taking knockouts a little bit quicker, because otherwise Nick's gonna certainly be able to mount a comeback here.
Yeah, the 4 Pokemon that TOLER brought actually play a very faster game, as opposed to the ones that Nick chose to bring, which, you know, typically play a slower part in how the team wins. Snorlax sets up curses, Clefairy redirects, there's Toxicking abound everywhere. Tapu Bulu, of course, restoring everyone's health with the grassy terrain. So we're going to see Garchomp come in here, that fabled Garchomp that lived that classic hit. And Clefairy once again becomes the center of attention with that Follow Me. Arcanine going for a Flare Blitz onto Clefairy, targeting it down, just barely clinging on. This is the game of invisible focus set.
This is absolutely insane. The way these Pokemon have been trained to be so bulky. A big thing there though, activating the Aguave Berry could be huge.
Snorlax going to target into Garchomp, getting some rough skin damage, but I think the bigger thing here is that TOLER now has the option to bring in either Tapu Koko, get rid of terrain, which actually is probably going to dissipate relatively soon. I think the bigger option here is maybe bringing in Ninetales to kind of help sweep up and get some bigger KOs a lot faster. Arcanine taking big damage from that Toxic, as I believe Clefairy not enough to take it out. Clefairy takes that burn damage, but it is just not enough. It is clinging on.
Clefairy still around, still has that threat of the Follow Me. Of course, Arcanine has to be very, very cautious the way that it's been playing. It is taking a lot of damage from these Toxics building up over time. So Ninetales, the fastest Pokemon on the field, does have the liberty really to maybe throw out a Blizzard, and there is the option with Arcanine on the field to maybe try and, you know, switch it out, get that terrain back up, and then Tapu Koko may be able to help out. Of course, you're going to have a little bit of chip damage from Hail, you're going to have a little bit of chip damage from Blizzard and a Thick Fat, and then if he gets Tapu Koko back in, I think Tapu Koko would be safe enough actually to knock out the Snorlax without activating the Berry. Of course, Clefairy has to be gone by that point, so that's really, really big here. TOLER still has to keep his foot on the gas and not give Nick time to really start playing his game again. Ninetales probably the key part of that as well.
Yeah, despite the grassy terrain health increase this turn and the burn, we saw those two balance each other out with Clefairy, but that's not going to matter this turn as Clefairy gets withdrawn and replaced with Arcanine. So Arcanine's going to come in, be a relatively good check to that Ninetales. Snorlax again with that Thick Fat, not really going to be taking that much damage from Ninetales in general. Blizzard from Ninetales connects to both Pokemon, again doing very, very minimal damage. Will-O-Wisp avoids the Snorlax as it goes for a high horsepower into Arcanine. No more Aurora Veil this time as Arcanine gets a clean knockout from that high horsepower. Arcanine just missing those Will-O-Wisps today. Yeah,
that Will-O-Wisp not connecting with Snorlax is really, really big. He needed that to basically buy some time, and I think TOLER's kind of let himself fall behind a little bit by not switching that terrain sooner. He is now down to his last 2, but they are going to be a little bit difficult to take out. This Ninetales, I think, struggling against both the Pokemon Nick has on this side of the field. He's relying so heavily on Tapu Koko under this terrain. Of course, Ninetales has one very cheeky little option, and that, of course, is to catch Snorlax with a freeze. Something like that would be absolutely fantastic. But the targeting of this Tapu Koko is going to be essential now. Without Garchomp on the field, he doesn't have the option to discharge in electric terrain, and I think what he goes for is so essential every single time. Of course, we do know there is the Burn Clefairy in the back, but he's got to start picking off the right targets with the two that are showing on the field right now. Yeah,
it may in fact come down to mind games as we are nearing the end, I fear, of Game 1 in this last top 4. Arcanine going to be withdrawn on Nick's side of the field, replaced with Clefairy. So hopefully no targets down on that Clefairy this turn, but Tapu Koko Thunderbolts into that Clefairy slot. So relatively sacking off that Clefairy, getting another switch in on the Arcanine, but Aurora Veil gets set up by Ninetales, so a good defensive maneuver by TOLER there. High horsepower coming in, going to do some big damage to Tapu Koko, and it is enough to get a 2-hit KO, but it's not enough to pick up the knockout this turn.
That Aurora Veil is absolutely essential, and this is what we were talking about with Snorlax being such a threat. Now the question is for TOLER, does he know about Snorlax's potential items? With Arcanine coming on the field, there is the chance that Arcanine on Nick's side has extreme speed and may be able to come exceptionally close to the knockout on the Tapu Koko. If it does, you know, Snorlax, as we were talking about, does have that option. If it goes below 25% of its health, it will get that berry activated on it, and it will stay around. Snorlax is going to be targeted by something this turn, though, and it is the Tapu Koko.
Tapu Koko launches a big Thunderbolt into Snorlax, getting that knockout. Ninetales going for the Blizzard. Going to be doing single target damage, but not a whole lot to that Arcanine. Arcanine going for the Flare Blitz. It will indeed target down Tapu Koko, and that is not enough to take it out, but I fear that after hail damage, it will be knocked out, and that is exactly the case. So Tapu Koko going down to its partner's weather damage this turn, and now we are faced with a very, very curious hit point position. Ninetales at full health. I don't think we've seen the item on Ninetales. Is it possibly that Focus Sash?
Ninetales are pretty much exclusively Focus Sash, but I want to dive in real quick. And the item's so important here. If Arcanine's carrying one of those pinch berries that gets activated, it's going to be very much game, set, and, well, game for this one. There it is. It is the Mago Berry. So taking itself back up to 75% of its health, and Arcanine's going to start dealing a ton of damage with Flare Blitz. Of course, the recall is going to fall in Ninetales' favor, but it's on that Focus Sash. This is going to be close. I think Arcanine has the edge, though.
So Arcanine taking big recoil damage, obviously doing massive damage to that Ninetales, and I feel like we're in the same position we were just last turn, except now Ninetales is not nearly looking as healthy.
No, not at all, and with the extreme speed, there's no way out for TOLER. He was getting a lot of value out of that Aurora Veil, but in a couple of situations, Nick's team building so essential. What we had there was actually the way that these pinch berries work. You think you're about to be able to knock out a Pokemon, but then that berry activates. You're sticking around for another couple of turns, and it's so difficult to really gauge that knockout. So Nick showing the power there of the Margot and the Papa berry. Of course, it didn't activate on Snorlax in that game, but TOLER was just struggling a little bit to deal those really big hits, I think, because of the threat of the Clefairy, because of those kind of intimidates coming down, really made it tough for him.
And something we've seen all tournament is the skill that these players are using with those pinch berries, not necessarily getting them activated by their opponent's attacks, but rather knowing how much damage their recoil is going to do to their own Pokemon, and then activating it that way, which is exactly what we saw in this last game. It's not an uncommon thing that we've seen, and that just goes to show the skill level that these players put in to their team building and knowing how much damage is going to do what.
They're getting so much value out of all of these item choices, I think, and I really do like Nick's team, seeing it in action. You know, the Clefairy keeping the Tapu Bulu safe, very, very interesting. I'd be curious to know the damage calculation with, of course, that Gracium Z bringing the Bloom Doom. If it was just falling short because of maybe a little bit of luck in Nick's favor, you know, or TOLER's favor in that case, could be a very, very different game indeed. But whatever happens this game, both these players have played their heart out. Interesting to note, Nick, in his past 4 regionals, has finished his run at the top 4. I know he's desperate to end that run now, and it's really within his grasp after what we saw in Game 1.
TOLER is no stranger either. TOLER getting back into it, doing one heck of a run this weekend. I mean, he is on fire. He wants it just as badly. Nick, of course, also finally maybe wanting to break that curse, no pun intended. But we're going to see Nick lead with Arcanine and Tapu Bulu as TOLER opens up with Ninetales and Tapu Koko.
Well, we are going to see the terrain warfare, I think that's an awful term for it, but the terrain matchup fall in Nick's favor. He does get the grassy terrain up, and that was something I noted in game 1, that TOLER left the grassy terrain in play for a very long time. That residual healing, I think, was so important to some of Nick's strategy. His whole strategy seems to be about keeping his Pokemon around, keeping them healthy. He's got Heal Pulse, he's got these pinch berries, he's got the grassy terrain, so being able to keep those around so essential, and without that kind of switching and getting the control of the terrain, really difficult for TOLER. The problem is, in these turns where you are desperate to change the terrain, you Volt Switch, that can be read into it and really played around. So be curious to see if TOLER goes for it. Maybe just tries to push through without the terrain in his favor, though. That I think the Ninetales in the lead really could help him out here. Does have to be concerned about Arcanine, of course.
TOLER does have some options. We've seen the Volt Switch. We've seen him reposition himself. Again, like you said, maybe waiting a little bit too long to do that last game. Nick going to withdraw Tapu Bulu and replace it with Snorlax, as Tapu Koko indeed does go for the Volt Switch into the Arcanine, doing some big damage there, as we're going to see some repositioning on the field. Perhaps TOLER's going to think about how to handle that newly introduced Snorlax on the field, and Garchomp comes in. That is one way to handle an Arcanine, if I've ever seen one, as Ninetales sets up that Aurora Veil, so going to be doing less damage to everyone on TOLER's side of the field, as Arcanine sets up a Toxic onto Garchomp.
Yeah, that's a really good turn, I think, for Nick. He manages to get his Tapu Bulu out safely and actually save it for later, so knowing the Volt Switch is coming, knowing TOLER's looking to bring that in, all he needs to do is get a Pokemon numbers advantage, and then he'll be in a pretty good position, I think, to really deal with it. Obviously, he still has grassy terrain up for the next sort of few turns at the minimum, so Garchomp is going to be forced, if it wants to do big damage, to use Tectonic Rage. I think maybe removing the Ninetales from play here could be important to gain control of that terrain, but Garchomp put on a timer is going to be able to help out a little bit with that rough skin if Nick decides to start attacking him. But changing the terrain up now is going to be so important. He needs to deal with this Arcanine, so as soon as that's removed from play, Ninetales becomes a whole lot easier to deal with and use in this matchup.
Now that TOLER has the Aurora Veil set up, there might be a safer position for him to bring in Tapu Koko maybe sooner than he did with this last game. Arcanine going to be able to protect, no switching this turn. Blizzard from Ninetales connects onto the Snorlax and not into the Arcanine, as he did just protect it, doing very sad damage to that Snorlax, as Garchomp follows a Poison Jab into that protected Arcanine, and Snorlax is going to start doing what it did last turn, or last game rather, where it just starts cursing.
Well, we saw the Poison Jab going towards the Arcanine is interesting. The way I look at that is he's a little bit concerned with the Clefairy coming in to Friend Guard and make things very difficult to deal with. So the way I see that one going is curious. He just leaves the Ninetales in for a lot of time though, and I think that's kind of slowing him down. That Tapu Koko could be so essential. It doesn't particularly care about the boost from Curse. It does have the opportunity to really capitalize on the Aurora Veil as well. So that's something I think TOLER really needs to up the pace on a little bit here. He has that team that's very offensive, but with the Thick Fat on Snorlax, with the Fire typing on Arcanine, it's certainly difficult for this Ninetales to be doing good work here, and maybe he's just fishing for a freeze as the status condition that we haven't seen yet out of these Blizzards.
I think it's interesting actually that Ninetales is on the field, and it's not really been a priority for Nick to try and get the knockout. He's just kind of let it set up Aurora Veils. He knows that there's a Focus Sash on it. He knows it's a big threat to Tapu Bulu, but he's playing it relatively passively, and he's focusing on TOLER's other Pokemon that keep switching in and out on that side of the field. I think it's an interesting choice by Nick, and it's definitely paying off right now. And as I say that, Arcanine's going to go ahead and fire off at extreme speed into the Ninetales, going to break that Focus Sash, bring Arcanine down to half health, and a little bit of damage to Snorlax. Rounding on the Z, Garchomp is making an appearance here. We are going to see a Tectonic Rage fire off, not impacted by that grassy terrain. It's really good for TOLER right now, and it's going to target down the Arcanine slot. So we're going to get rid of the Arcanine. Definitely a threat on Nick's side of the team. Nick's side of the field better, but I don't know about that Snorlax. That Snorlax is in a good position.
Well, this is super important. We noticed he extreme speeded. He knew, I think, that he was going to be removed from play. So he wanted to get something down, and very importantly, he breaks the focus sash here on the Ninetales. So that makes it a little bit easier to deal with later in the game. Garchomp taking that frustration relatively well, though. It does get to retaliate with a little bit of rough skin damage. Of course, there is going to be some healing coming out from that grassy terrain, which TOLER, again, has left in play. But, you know, Garchomp is been on the field for a couple turns now with Toxic going on. It's going to start to really be a threat of just getting knocked out by the Toxic. The next turn certainly would do it, so Garchomp probably forced to switch if it wants to attack again. It has removed the Arcanine from play, which means this Ninetales is a little more at leisure, but Arcanine did one of the best things it could and made that Focus Sash null and void.
Clefairy going to be coming out to replace that Arcanine on Nick's side of the field. Friend Guard is now up, so it's going to prolong the health of Snorlax even longer. Grassy Terrain is up, so if Garchomp wanted to Earthquake, wouldn't be doing that much either. Again, Garchomp is on a timer. This, unless it gets switched out this turn, this is its last stand in this game too. So Nick's in a relatively bulky, good position. Again, Nick playing a slower, bulkier, more concentrated game, whereas TOLER, I think, is playing, though defensive maneuvers like with Aurora Veil are present, and the switch initiative and things like that, he's playing a bit more faster offensive game, and I don't know, I think the pace has always kind of been with Nick for most of these turns.
He's certainly had the upper hand, I think, and just the amount of damage he's able to mitigate by redirection, by Friend Guard, is so important, and here's another great way to mitigate damage.
Blizzard coming in, going to do some damage, ignoring the follow me on Clefairy. Snorlax going to use Frustration into Ninetales. That will be enough to pick up the knockout. Ninetales has fainted. As Garchomp goes for Roar, and roars out the Clefairy. Tapu Bulu is going to be coming back in now, so I think Garchomp was likely roaring out the Snorlax there, but it got redirected thanks to Clefairy's Follow Me.
Well, I think there's a couple of curious things going on there. Maybe he wanted to remove the Snorlax from play, but he really needed, of course, the Ninetales to be there. It would have knowingly dragged out the Tapu Bulu. He wants that Ninetales in play to deal with that, but Nick just decides to remove the Ninetales. That's the next biggest threat to his team. That's gone. Now Garchomp's been knocked out by the poison, so TOLER, down to his last two Pokemon, he is going to have the option to set the terrain to his electric terrain. That is definitely preferred for him. But Nick has the freedom to just switch out Tapu Bulu, bring in Clefairy again, and he doesn't have that solid answer to this Snorlax. The Snorlax on Nick's side of the field has been so essential recently. It is the Celesteela alongside the Tapu Koko, so could be a slow burner of a game. That grassy terrain wouldn't help it out, but I don't see a really solid answer to Tapu Bulu here.
No, I mean, if Celesteela happens to be carrying something like Heavy Slam, like
Flamethrower would be pretty useful.
That would do some damage against Tapu Bulu, but again, Nick has that freedom to switch things around, redirect terrain. He also has Clefairy in the back, so we know Friend Guard is going to make an impact. We saw how much that Poison Jab from Garchomp did, so I'm willing to bet that under Friend Guard, Tapu Bulu is actually quite bulky. The question is, how much is Tapu Koko going to be able to attack Snorlax to clear that threat with Friend Guard active on the field? Even though it has terrain, we're going to see a Thunderbolt. It's going to connect with the Snorlax, and it's not going to do enough to KO, but it will do enough to activate Snorlax's berry, the Figgy Berry, as it gets back up to very high health. And there's the Heavy Slam from Celesteela into Clefairy. It will knock out the Clefairy, so we're going to see terrain reset as Tapu Bulu comes back in here for Nick's side of the field. That's his last Pokemon. Celesteela is going to get a special defense boost, and a Wild Charge from Snorlax into Celesteela is going to do some big damage there. The Hail is gone. No more Pokemon taking residual damage from weather at this point. Celesteela reveals the leftovers. It's going to get a little bit of health back. Aurora Veil is gone, so I think that Wild Charge live was very heavily impacted by that Aurora Veil still being active, but it's no longer an option that TOLER has available to him.
We still look at this Tapu Bulu though, and it's still a problem. It's got grassy terrain up, still has access to Bloom Doom. We've not seen any Z moves come out of that. I don't think Tapu Koko, of course the Friend Guard isn't going to be in there, but it has lost the electric terrain as well. Snorlax could definitely be a problem here. really going to have to go for a double target somewhere, but I think Nick just has the power. Showing the wild charge on that Snorlax shows he has a solid answer to Celesteela. That's a great adaptation in team building for him as we go in to see if there are going to be some knockouts.
Tapu Koko getting a paralysis onto the Snorlax after a big Thunderbolt, and here, just like that predicted, we see that Bloom Doom coming out from Tapu Bulu. I can't imagine that it's targeting down the Celesteela.
It's got to be going for Tapu Koko and removing it from play. Absolutely essential, because I think Celesteela may actually struggle to deal with a Tapu Bulu without Flamethrower. That'd be super important as Bloom Doom does target down Tapu Koko. No doubt in my mind, it's a knockout. That's actually a game show in Britain in the 80s. That is by the by as Tapu Koko is removed from field, and Celesteela reveals Flamethrower, doesn't target Tapu Bulu. Snorlax clings on and gets fully paralyzed.
So the problem I think that TOLER's going to have to deal with now is that Celesteela, while it is faster than the Snorlax with that paralysis, it's not faster than Tapu Bulu. And of course, terrain is still up. That issue that TOLER had last game that Nick kind of really capitalized on. That Snorlax is slowly going to be getting HP back every single turn. Now, granted, we are in a very, very end game here. Tapu Bulu going for a Wood Hammer onto Celesteela, and not enough to knock it out as it gets a little bit of recoil damage. Celesteela going for Heavy Slam onto the Snorlax. It is going to do not enough damage. It is another invisible Focus Sash as Snorlax goes for that Wild Charge, connecting to the Celesteela, getting that knockout. It will be knocked out from recoil, but Tapu Bulu stands alone on top its grassy knoll.
Yeah, it does, and Tapu Bulu, the last Pokemon remaining, really clings on there. That Celesteela, because of Nick's choice in ability, the move to Thick Fat has actually just single